The night he walked through that door, he was 20 years old, soaking wet, and had a bruise on his face that was already turning yellow at the edges. He stood in the entrance of the Hells Angels garage and said 3 words, so quietly that the man nearest the door had to lean forward to hear them. "Can I work here?" 8 bikers stopped what they were doing. Not all at once. One by one. Nobody in that town would have predicted what happened next. And nobody, not even the boy himself, could have known what was already waiting for him inside that building. Before we go any further, if stories like this one move you, if you believe that kindness can come from the most unexpected places and that the truth has a way of surviving longer than the people who tried to bury it, subscribe to this channel right now and drop your location in the comments below. Just your city, your state, wherever you're watching from tonight. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Because stories like this one deserve to travel. Now, let me tell you about a town called Sutter Ridge, and a garage on Millbrook Road, and a 20-year-old boy who walked through its door on a Tuesday night with a split lip and a bruise on his face and absolutely nothing left to lose. And let me tell you about what was already waiting for him inside. Sitting in a filing cabinet that nobody had opened in 7 years, in a building that a frightened woman had chosen, above every other place available to her, because she believed with everything she had that it would hold the truth long enough for it to matter. She was right. This is how it happened. There are towns in America where everybody eventually knows everybody's business. Not because people are nosy, though some are, but because the town is small enough that life overlaps whether you plan it to or not. You run into your neighbor at the hardware store. You see your kid's teacher at the gas station. You know which houses have lights on late and which ones go dark early. And after enough years, you know what that means. Sutter Ridge is that kind of town. 8,000 people. One main street that still has a barber shop and a diner that's been under the same family name for 31 years. The kind of place that doesn't make the news and mostly prefers it that way. People here raise their families, work their jobs, and keep an eye on what's happening around them the way people do when they understand, without ever saying it out loud, that a community only holds together because everyone in it quietly agrees to hold it. On Millbrook Road, about a mile east of the center of town, there is a building that has been there for 23 years. Most people in Sutter Ridge have an opinion about it. The Iron Gate Hells Angels garage sits behind a chain-link fence with a steel sign above the roll-up door, a row of motorcycles usually parked along the front, and a reputation that arrived in this town long before the men themselves did. People who have never set foot inside have a version of what it is. They picture something dark, something dangerous, something that doesn't belong in a town like this one. What they picture is not entirely wrong. These are not soft men. They have not lived soft lives. The road that brought each of them to this garage and to this chapter ran through things that most people in Sutter Ridge will never have to navigate. And the marks of that road are visible if you look. In the set of a jaw, in the way a man stands when he's relaxed, and how different that looks from the way he stands when he isn't. But the picture is incomplete. And incomplete pictures have a way of doing quiet damage. Because what is also true about the Iron Gate garage is this. The lights come on every morning at 6. The work is real, and it is done well. Paying customers, regular people, retired folks, veterans with weekend bikes, have been bringing their machines to this garage for more than 2 decades, and they keep coming back. Not out of obligation. Out of trust. That is not nothing. The man who runs it is named Raymond Callahan. Though no one who knows him has called him Raymond in 15 years. They call him Stone. He is 54 years old, broad through the shoulders, with gray threaded through his dark beard and both forearms mapped in ink that has blurred slightly with time into something personal and abstract. He became the president of this chapter when he was 31 years old, and in the 23 years since, he has developed the particular quality that long leadership either builds or breaks a man with. He does not hurry. He does not raise his voice when a lower one will do. He has been the person that other people look to when something goes wrong for so long that stillness has simply become his default setting. The way a river that has run the same course long enough eventually carves the shape of that course into itself. Near the entrance to the garage, the man they call Grip keeps his station. Shaved head, forearms covered in green tattoos done across several decades by several different hands. He is the one who sees people first, customers, club members, strangers, and he has a quality that surprises people who expect something else from a man who looks the way he does. He is patient. He is perceptive. He notices things before they become problems and handles them before they require handling. He is the reason most people who walk through that door for the first time walk back out feeling like they were treated fairly. Then there is the man they call Wrench, the senior mechanic, wiry and dark-eyed, who has the rare ability to read a room faster than almost anyone. He can listen to an engine for 60 seconds and tell you 3 things wrong with it and rank them by how soon they'll cost you. He can also tell you, 30 seconds after a stranger walks in, whether that person is a problem or not. He has been wrong about it twice in 11 years. These are the men of the Iron Gate garage. They had seen a great many things walk through that door in 23 years, but they had never seen anything quite like what arrived on that particular Tuesday night. And they had no way of knowing that what arrived with it. Invisible, tucked inside a filing cabinet they had walked past every single day, had been waiting for this exact moment. The rain started somewhere around 8 o'clock that evening and showed no sign of stopping. It was the kind of rain that doesn't announce itself with thunder or wind. It just arrives and settles in, steady and indifferent, the kind that soaks through a jacket in the first 5 minutes and keeps going after that because there is nothing left to soak through. The streets of Sutter Ridge were empty by 8:30. Sensible people were inside. The few cars still moving did so slowly, headlights catching the wet asphalt in long yellow streaks. Caleb Reyes had been walking in it for hours. He was 20 years old. Thin in the way young men are thin when they have been moving too much and eating too little. Not fragile, but stripped down to what's essential. His jacket was canvas, oversized, too light for the temperature, and completely wrong for the rain. It hung off his shoulders dark with water. His left eye carried a bruise that had been there long enough to turn yellow at the edges, deep purple still at the center, the kind of mark that tells you it wasn't recent and also tells you it wasn't small. His bottom lip was split and slightly swollen on the left side. He held himself upright with the particular effort of someone for whom upright has stopped being automatic. He had tried 6 places that night. Not begging, not explaining himself at length. Simply walking in and asking if there was any work, cleaning, stacking, anything. 5 of them had taken one look and closed the door before he finished the sentence. The 6th had said yes. The man behind the counter had smiled and told him there was work and told him what he would need to provide in return for it. Caleb had looked at him for a moment. Then he had turned around and walked back out into the rain and kept going. He had been walking for another 40 minutes when he saw the light on Millbrook Road. He stood at the corner for a long time. Long enough that the rain had filled the collar of his jacket and run cold down the back of his neck. He could see the sign from where he stood. He could see the motorcycles lined up along the front of the building. He understood exactly what kind of place he was looking at. He walked toward it anyway, because when every other door has closed, the door that scares you most becomes the only door left. And Caleb Reyes had run out of the luxury of fear some time ago. He pushed open the entrance and stepped inside. The garage was warm and loud in the way garages are loud. Compressors, tools on metal, the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead. For bikes up on lifts. A whiteboard near the door with appointments listed in 2 different handwritings. The smell of motor oil and burnt coffee and the particular human warmth of a room that has had people working in it all day. 8 men were doing various things when he walked in. And then, one by one, they stopped. Not because anyone said anything. Not because an alarm sounded. But because there are moments when something enters a room and the room registers it before anyone has consciously decided to pay attention. This was one of those moments. They stopped, a wrench set down, a rag laid flat, a phone lowered, and they looked at the figure standing in the entrance. Young, wet through, a bruise on his face and a split lip and a jacket that had given up keeping the rain out long before he arrived. His hands were hanging at his sides. You have to understand something about those hands. About the way Caleb was standing. It wasn't calm. What he had was not the stillness of a person at ease. It was trained stillness, the kind a person develops over years of learning that drawing attention to yourself in certain rooms, in certain households, costs something. The kind where you teach your body not to fidget, not to shift, not to take up more space than the minimum, because every time you did, something followed. The difference between a person who is at peace and a person who has learned that movement draws attention, that difference is visible if you know how to look. Stone knew how to look. Grip was the first one to speak. He set down the invoice he'd been working through, rose from his chair near the entrance, and looked at the boy with the careful attention of a man who has learned to assess a situation before he reacts to it. "You lost." Caleb didn't answer the question. He looked past Grip into the garage. He looked at the bikes on the lifts, at the men watching him, at the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead, at all of it, taking it in, filing it. Then he said 3 words, quietly enough that Grip had to lean forward slightly to be certain he'd heard them correctly. "Can I work here?" The room went still in a different way than it had been still a moment before. Grip held the boy's gaze for a moment. Then he turned his head toward the back of the garage and said one word, not loudly, just dropped it into the air like it belonged there. "Stone." Raymond Callahan looked up from the engine bay he'd been assessing, and he crossed the garage floor the way he crossed every floor, without hurrying, without announcing himself, covering the distance at the pace of a man who has decided that whatever is on the other end of it will still be there when he arrives. He stopped about 8 feet from the boy and looked at him. Really looked. The jacket, the eye, the lip, the hands at the sides. He took all of it in before he opened his mouth, because that was simply how Stone operated. He understood before he spoke, and he didn't speak until he understood. "You alone?" "Yes." "You in trouble with somebody?" A pause. Not long. Half a second, maybe less. "Not anymore." Stone didn't follow that. "Not yet." "How'd you end up at our door?" Caleb told him. 6 places. Most had closed before he finished asking. One had said yes, but the man behind it wanted something in return that Caleb wasn't going to give. So he kept walking. He said it plainly, without self-pity and without drama, the way a person recounts a series of facts when the facts speak well enough for themselves. Stone listened to all of it. Then he said, "You hungry?" And here is the moment that mattered. The reflex formed instantly. You could almost see it, the automatic response rising up before any conscious decision had been made. The words "I'm fine" were already on their way. The trained response of someone who has learned that admitting need creates vulnerability, and vulnerability has costs. Caleb stopped it himself, caught it mid-breath, and said instead, quietly and without decoration, "Yeah, I'm hungry." Stone turned toward Wrench at the back of the garage and said his name once, and Wrench was already moving before Stone had finished saying it. He came back a few minutes later with a paper plate carrying 2 sandwiches, a bottle of water, and a gray hooded sweatshirt with Iron Gate printed across the chest in cracked white letters. He set them down in front of the boy without ceremony and without comment, and Caleb sat down and ate. While Wrench was gone, Caleb ate with the careful focus of someone who is very hungry and has learned not to show how hungry they are, not because they're too proud, but because showing it had taught them, at some point, that hunger was information other people could use against you. He kept it measured, controlled, the same way he kept everything. But his eyes were moving, not anxiously, not the scanning of someone frightened or calculating an exit, something more deliberate than that. His gaze moved across the garage the way a person reads a page they intend to remember, taking in the tool pegboards and how they were organized, the bikes on the lifts and what stage each one was at, the whiteboard near the entrance with its 2 columns of handwriting, the supply shelves along the far wall, the positioning of the men and what each one was doing and how each one held himself. He was filing it, all of it, building a picture of the place from the inside out, quietly, while everyone in the room was deciding what to make of him. Stone pulled up a stool a few feet away and sat down. He waited until the boy had eaten enough to take the edge off before he spoke. "Tell me something. What makes you think you could work in a motorcycle garage?" Caleb set down the second sandwich and looked at him directly. "I can learn anything," he said. "That's not ego. That's just, I've had to." A pause. Then he looked toward the entrance. "Your appointment board is wrong." Stone tilted his head very slightly. Caleb nodded toward the whiteboard by the door. "You've got 3 bikes listed as pending under Tuesday. But those bikes are already finished. They're sitting right there against the far wall. Any customer who walks in tomorrow morning and checks that board is going to assume those bays are tied up. You'll turn away work you could have taken." From somewhere near the tool bench, Grip made a sound, low and brief. The sound a man makes when he is suppressing a laugh and not entirely succeeding. Stone looked at the whiteboard, looked at the 3 bikes against the wall, looked back at Caleb. "You got that in 5 minutes. 4, Caleb said. And then, because he couldn't quite stop himself, I counted. Something changed in Stone's face. It wasn't a smile. Stone was not a man who arrived at smiles quickly or cheaply. It was something closer to recognition. The specific look of a person who has spent decades in rooms full of people who talked large and delivered less, and who has learned, through long experience, to hear the difference between performance and the real thing. What Caleb was doing was not performance. Stone folded his arms. You got anyone in Sutter Ridge who can vouch for you? Anyone I can call? No. Why not? Caleb looked at him. Steady. Unhurried. Because I came here alone, and I've been careful about that. About people not knowing where I am. Because of whoever gave you that eye. It wasn't a question. Stone said it the way he said most things, as a statement of something he had already concluded, offered plainly so the other person could confirm or correct it. Caleb didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't shift in his seat. I didn't come here to talk about that. Stone held his gaze for a moment. No, he said quietly. You came here to work. Yes. Stone could have sent him away right then. Nobody in that garage would have questioned it. A bruised stranger arriving after dark with no references, no local connections, no explanation for the state of his face. That was not an obvious candidate for anything except a polite refusal and a closed door. That was the reasonable call, the careful one. But Stone didn't make it. And that decision, made on a Tuesday night in a garage on Millbrook Road while the rain kept coming down, would eventually set in motion a reckoning that the town of Sutter Ridge would still be talking about years later. Stone was quiet for a long moment after that. Not the quiet of a man who hasn't made up his mind. More the quiet of a man who has made it up and is simply letting it settle before he speaks. The garage had returned to a low hum around them. A compressor running somewhere near the back, the rain still working steadily against the metal roof, the occasional sound of a tool being set down and picked back up again. The men had gone back to what they were doing, or at least to the appearance of it. Nobody was fooling anyone. Stone unfolded his arms. Here's what I'll tell you, he said. I'm not making a decision tonight. Tonight is not the night for decisions. Tonight you need to get dry and eat the rest of that food and sleep somewhere that isn't a parking structure or a doorway. Caleb opened his mouth. Stone raised one hand. Not sharply, just a single calm gesture that communicated, without any ambiguity, that the sentence was not finished and the response could wait. There's a room in the back. We use it for storage. But there's a cot in it, and a blanket, and the door locks from the inside. He paused. In the morning, you come find me, and we'll talk about what comes next. Caleb looked at him. The expression that crossed his face in that moment was not gratitude, exactly, or not only gratitude. It was something more complicated than that. The look of a person who has been offered something so basic, so simply human, that they are not entirely sure how to receive it. Like a muscle that has been tensed for so long that the instruction to relax doesn't quite compute. Why would you do that? He asked, and the question was genuine. Not suspicious, not a negotiation. Genuinely puzzled, the way a person becomes puzzled by ordinary decency when they have gone long enough without encountering it. Stone looked at him for a moment. Because you walked through a rainstorm to ask for honest work, he said. And because tonight is not the night to put you back outside. Caleb was quiet. Then he said, Thank you. Don't thank me, Stone said, and his voice carried the same steady weight it always carried, neither warm nor cold, just even. You haven't worked a day for us yet. The storage room was small. It smelled like motor oil and cardboard and the particular mustiness of a space that holds things rather than people. There were shelves along one wall stacked with boxed parts and folded tarps and the accumulated miscellany of a working garage. A single bulb overhead on a pull cord, and against the far wall, a cot, narrow, functional, with a wool blanket folded neatly at the foot of it, as though someone had thought to put it there, which someone had. The door had a deadbolt. It locked from the inside. Caleb sat on the edge of the cot for a moment. He looked at the deadbolt. Then he reached over and slid it closed. The sound it made was small. A simple mechanical click, the kind you don't notice in a place where you feel safe. But Caleb sat with it for a moment after it settled. Just sat with it. He reached down and pulled off his wet shoes and set them on the floor. He lay down on the cot without taking off his jacket, pulled the wool blanket up over himself, and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The single bulb off now, the room dark, the rain on the roof above him steady and low like something breathing. He was asleep in minutes. Not the thin, defensive half-sleep of someone who has learned to stay partly alert because the alternative is dangerous. Real sleep, the kind that comes when the body finally receives permission to stop holding itself ready. For the first time in longer than he could easily calculate, the door was locked from the inside. He had done the locking. What Caleb didn't know, what nobody in that garage knew yet, was that while he slept in that storage room, the men at the table in the room next door were having a conversation about him that would matter more than any of them could have predicted. They talked about the boy, about the bruise and the split lip and the way he'd stood, about the appointment board and the 4 minutes and what that said about the kind of mind he was carrying, about whether a person with no vouching and no history and no explanation for that was something the Iron Gate chapter had room for, and what Stone said at that table, quietly, without drama, in the same, even voice he said everything, would set in motion a chain of events that would not stop until the whole town of Sutter Ridge had to reckon with something it had been choosing not to see for 7 years. But that was still to come. For now, there was only the rain on the roof, and the boy asleep on the cot, and the deadbolt holding. Caleb was awake before 5. He had slept, genuinely slept, the deep kind he hadn't managed in weeks. But whatever mechanism had kept him alive and alert through the months before this night was not ready to surrender entirely. It brought him up out of sleep at 4 in the morning into a room that was dark and quiet and smelled like motor oil. And for a moment he lay completely still, the way you do when you wake somewhere unfamiliar and your body is checking the information before your mind catches up. Then he remembered the deadbolt. He lay there for a few minutes listening to the building settle around him, the faint drip of rainwater somewhere outside, the low creak of the roof cooling in the early morning dark. The rain had stopped at some point while he slept. The storage room was still. There was no threat in the stillness. He got up anyway, not because he had to, not because anything required it, but because Caleb Reyes had been given something the night before, a chance or the edge of one. And he understood, without having to think it through, that the only currency he had to offer in return was what he could do with his hands and his mind before anyone arrived to see him doing it. So he found a light switch, and then he found a mop. Grip rolled up the garage door at 6:50 in the morning with a cup of coffee in one hand, the same as every morning, and stopped in the entrance the way a man stops when his eyes are telling him something his brain hasn't processed yet. The front bay floor was clean, not wiped down clean, not swept in a hurry clean, but properly mopped, corner to corner, the concrete showing its actual color in the flat morning light rather than the gray-brown accumulation of a working garage. The kind of clean that takes time and intention and the willingness to move every obstacle rather than work around it. Grip looked at the floor. Then he looked at the whiteboard. The appointment board had been completely reorganized. The errors from the night before, the finished bikes listed as pending, the confused scheduling, were gone. In their place was a clean, logical layout sorted by day, written in the same careful block lettering, consistent in size and spacing in a way that made it immediately readable from across the room. Then he looked at the parts cabinet. He stood in front of it for a moment the way you stand in front of something when you are trying to determine if what you are seeing is real. The parts cabinet had been, for as long as most of the men could remember, a system that worked primarily through familiarity. You knew where things were because you'd put them there yourself, or because you'd watched someone else put them there, and if you were new, you simply asked and hoped the person you asked remembered correctly. Bins were mislabeled or unlabeled. Categories had drifted over years of parts being returned to whatever space was open rather than wherever they belonged. It had been transformed. Every bin carried a new label, written on an index card in the same neat block letters as the appointment board, affixed cleanly and consistently at the same height across every row. Every category had been grouped, fasteners together, filters together, gaskets together, electrical components separated from mechanical ones. The logic of it was immediately apparent. You could find what you needed in 10 seconds rather than 3 minutes, and you would know before you pulled a bin whether it contained what you were looking for. Grip stood there for a moment longer. Then he turned around, walked back out of the garage, went to Stone's office door, and knocked on it. Stone looked up. You need to see what he did. Stone stood in front of the parts cabinet for a full minute. He didn't speak. He opened several bins, one at a time, and checked the contents against the labels and closed them again. He looked at the board. He looked at the floor. He looked at all of it with the methodical attention of a man who is not performing an assessment, but actually conducting one, taking the information in and turning it over carefully before reaching any conclusion. Then he turned around. Caleb was standing about 15 feet away, arms at his sides, back straight. His expression was neutral in the specific way that a person's expression is neutral when they have done something they are genuinely proud of and are holding themselves very still while they wait to find out if it is going to matter. Not performing indifference. Actually waiting. The face of someone who has learned that wanting something too visibly makes you vulnerable, but who cannot quite hide the fact that this one matters. Stone looked at him. How long did this take you? About 2.5 hours, Caleb said. I couldn't sleep after 4. Stone was quiet for a moment. You want breakfast? I want to know if I'm working here. The garage was very still. Not the stillness of men pretending not to listen. The stillness of men who have stopped pretending entirely and are simply listening, because what happened next was worth hearing. Stone looked at him for one more moment. Yeah, he said. You're working here. Something happened in Caleb's face then. It was not dramatic. It was not a smile or a visible surge of relief or anything that announced itself. It was smaller than that and more significant. The almost imperceptible release of something that had been held very tightly for a very long time. Like a breath let out so slowly you can barely see it happen. Like a fist opening. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me, Stone said, and his voice was the same as it always was. Level, unhurried, carrying the weight of a man who means what he says and says what he means and has never found much use for the space between those two things. I'm going to work you hard and pay you fair. That's all we know right now. Caleb held his gaze. That's enough, he said. And he meant it. Completely and without qualification. Because for a person who has been given very little for a very long time, fair pay and honest work and a door that locks from the inside is not a small thing. It is, in fact, everything. Caleb had no way of knowing it yet. No reason to know it. No way to have guessed it. But the parts cabinet he had reorganized in the small hours of that morning was going to matter in a way that had nothing whatsoever to do with motorcycle parts. Because tucked behind it, against the back wall of the garage, sat a filing cabinet that nobody had opened in years. And in the bottom drawer of that cabinet, behind a collapsed hanging folder and 4 years of oil change receipts, something had been waiting. Something that someone had placed there 7 years ago, carefully, deliberately, with the specific intention that it would be kept safe long enough to matter. It had been kept safe. It was still waiting. And the boy who had just earned his place in this garage was the only person in the world it had been waiting for. A working garage has a rhythm to it that takes time to learn and longer to feel. It isn't the kind of rhythm you can read in a manual or pick up in an afternoon. It lives in the specific sequence of things. Which jobs get prioritized and why? Which suppliers call back and which ones need chasing? How the phones need to be answered so that a customer who's nervous about leaving their bike somewhere unfamiliar leaves the conversation feeling like they made the right choice. It lives in the relationship between the front desk and the shop floor, in the way information needs to move between the man writing the invoice and the man doing the labor, in the 100 small decisions that get made every hour without anyone formally deciding them, because the people making them have done it long enough that the decisions have become instinct. The Iron Gate garage ran on this rhythm the way a well-maintained engine runs. Not without complexity, not without the occasional misfire, but fundamentally and reliably. It had been running this way for years. And into this rhythm, in the days that followed that first wet Tuesday night, Caleb Reyes inserted himself with the careful attention of someone who understands that a new environment is a thing to be read before it is a thing to be acted upon. He paid attention to everything, not anxiously. Not the surveillance of someone looking for threats, though he knew how to do that too. This was different. This was the deliberate, patient mapping of a person who has learned that understanding how a place works is the first step toward being useful inside it. He watched how the work flowed. He watched how the men communicated, what they said directly, and what they communicated through silence or gesture or the particular way someone set a tool down. He watched who deferred to whom, and in what circumstances and why. He filed all of it. And in the filing, he began to understand the men. Grip was the first surprise, not to anyone who knew him, to Caleb, who had only the evidence in front of him. Because Grip, by any external accounting, was not a man who should be the first point of contact for anxious customers bringing in bikes they cared about. He was large and quiet and decorated with decades of ink, and he had the kind of face that a lifetime of outdoor living and hard weather had made into something that didn't invite casual conversation. And yet, Caleb watched him one morning with a retired schoolteacher named Mr. Aldrich, who had brought in a 1984 Sportster that had been his late wife's and who was visibly uncertain about being there. Grip had spoken to him for 12 minutes. Quietly, specifically, asking questions about the bike and what it meant and what he wanted for it. By the time Mr. Aldrich left, he was shaking Grip's hand and had made an appointment for the following month. Caleb watched all of this from the front desk and filed it under things that were true about this place that the town's version of it would never account for. Wrench was a different kind of education entirely. He was the senior mechanic, and his relationship with engines was the kind that looked, from the outside, almost like intuition. Though it wasn't intuition, it was simply 10,000 hours compressed into instinct. He could listen to a motor run for 60 seconds and identify 3 things wrong with it, and tell you which one to fix first and why. What Caleb hadn't expected was that Wrench would begin, almost immediately, to explain things while he worked. Not as instruction exactly. Not condescendingly. Not with the patience of someone simplifying for a slower mind. More the way a craftsman talks when they realize the person standing next to them is actually listening. Actually tracking what's being said and storing it rather than waiting politely for the talking to stop. Wrench had encountered that kind of attention rarely enough that when he found it, he responded to it naturally, the way water finds a channel. He talked while he worked, and Caleb listened and learned and asked the occasional precise question, and by the end of the first week Wrench had stopped registering it as teaching and simply started registering it as company. Then there was Bishop. Bishop was the sergeant-at-arms, which in practical terms meant he was the man responsible for the security and order of the chapter. The one who thought about risk before other people thought to think about it, who maintained the kind of watchful awareness that some men are born with and others develop through experience, and Bishop had arrived at through some combination of both. He was quiet in the way that very observant people are often quiet, not because they have nothing to say, but because listening yields more than speaking, and he had understood this early. He was the most skeptical of Caleb from the beginning. He didn't say so. That wasn't his way. But Caleb was perceptive enough to feel it. The quality of Bishop's attention when Caleb was in the room, the way he tracked without appearing to track, the particular stillness of a man who has not yet categorized something and is reserving judgment with the patience of someone who knows that judgment made too early is just assumption wearing a different name. Bishop watched Caleb the way you watch a variable you don't yet understand. Carefully. Continuously. Without hostility, but without warmth either. Not yet. And Stone. Stone arrived first every morning and left last every night. In between, he moved through the garage with the same unhurried authority he brought to everything. Present without hovering. Available without being underfoot. At the end of each day, after the last customer had gone and the last bike had been covered and the tools had been put back where they lived, Stone would walk through the garage one final time. Arms crossed, head slightly bowed, moving slowly through the space, not looking for anything specific, but simply listening to the building settle into the quiet. It was a ritual, though he would not have called it that. It was simply what he did, the way some people need a moment at the end of a day to mark the boundary between it and what comes after. Caleb noticed this too, filed it, understood, without being told, that this was a man for whom the work itself was something close to sacred. Not in any formal sense, but in the way that matters more, which is the day-to-day practice of taking what you do seriously because it is yours and it is real. By Thursday of that first week, Caleb had found the billing error. It was not obvious. It was the kind of problem that hides inside routine. A discrepancy between the labor estimates being written up front and the invoices being generated at the desk, a gap in communication that had been producing consistent overcharges for 2 regular customers for months. He found it by reading through the invoice records in a slow hour on Wednesday afternoon, and he confirmed it by cross-referencing with the estimate sheets going back through the filing cabinet. And by Thursday, he understood not just that it existed, but approximately when it had started and why. On Friday morning, before Stone arrived, he left a note on Stone's desk. 3 sentences. The problem, the scope, the proposed remedy. Stone came to find him at noon. You found the billing problem. It's been happening since February, Caleb said. 2 regular customers have been overcharged on every invoice since then. I can draft the credit letters if you want. Stone looked at him. How do you know it started in February? The handwriting on the labor estimates changed in February. Someone new started writing them. The new handwriting is harder to read, and the desk was misreading a number consistently, a 7 being logged as a 1. A pause. Wrench broke 2 fingers in January, Stone said. They healed a little sideways. Caleb looked at him. That would explain it. Stone stared at him for a moment that was slightly longer than the moment before it. Then he said, "Draft the letters." Here is what's remarkable about what Caleb was doing in those first weeks, and it is worth saying plainly. He was not performing competence. He was not staying late to be seen staying late, or finding problems to announce that he had found them, or doing extra work so that someone would notice and tell him he had done well. He wasn't managing his image inside the garage any more than he managed anything else that way. He was simply doing what he had always done, paying close attention to the world immediately around him and making it function better than he found it. It was the same skill he had used for years to navigate a household where being useful was the only reliable form of safety. The same skill that had kept him fed and housed and invisible inside Vincent Hargrove's world for 5 years by making himself indispensable in ways that were never quite dramatic enough to draw the wrong kind of attention. The skill hadn't changed. The room had changed. And that is the whole of it, really. The difference between a person whose intelligence keeps them invisible and a person whose intelligence makes them indispensable is not the intelligence. It is the room they are standing in when they use it. It is whether the people around them are the kind who take from what others offer or the kind who recognize it and make space for it to grow. Caleb Reyes had spent years in the wrong room. He was beginning, carefully and without yet entirely believing it, to understand that he might finally be standing in the right one. Acceptance, in a place like the Iron Gate Garage, did not arrive as an announcement. There was no meeting called, no formal decision made, no moment where someone stood up and declared that Caleb Reyes had passed whatever threshold existed and was now one of them. That was not how it worked here, and perhaps that was not how it worked anywhere that mattered. The real kind of acceptance, the kind that holds, the kind that means something when it's tested, doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. It arrives through small gestures that seem insignificant individually and only reveal their weight when you step back and realize how many of them there are, and how consistently they've been offered, and what it would mean if they stopped. It arrived, in Caleb's case, one small gesture at a time. It arrived in the coffee. Grip had started making it sometime in the second week, appearing at the front desk in the morning with 2 cups instead of 1, setting the second down near Caleb's work without comment or eye contact, moving on before acknowledgement was possible or required. 1 sugar, no milk. Grip had never asked. He had simply paid attention, the way he paid attention to everything, and then acted on what he'd observed, and never once made anything of it. It happened every morning. It was never mentioned. And in its consistency and its silence, it communicated something that a more elaborate gesture could not have, that Caleb's presence in this place had become, to at least one of the men inside it, simply assumed. It arrived in the way Wrench talked while he worked. By the 3rd week, Wrench had stopped framing Caleb's mechanical education as something offered and started treating it as something shared. The natural byproduct of 2 people working near each other, one of whom knew a great deal and the other of whom was absorbing everything being said with the kind of focused retention that makes a craftsman want to keep talking. There was no condescension in it. There was no performance of teaching. There was simply Wrench explaining what he was doing because Caleb was listening, and Caleb listening because Wrench was worth listening to. And between those 2 facts, a kind of working companionship had formed that neither of them had named and neither of them needed to. And then there was Bishop. It was a Thursday evening at the end of the 3rd week. The garage was winding down for the day. Engines going quiet, tools being returned to their places, the particular low-key transition of a working space moving from active to still. Caleb was at the front, getting his jacket from the hook near the office door, going through the end-of-day routine he had by now made his own. Bishop was across the room. He didn't call out. He simply moved to where Caleb was, unhurried, with the same contained deliberateness he brought to everything, and he stopped a few feet away. "You doing all right?" Caleb looked at him. "Yeah." Bishop held his gaze for a moment, not challenging, assessing, the way he always assessed, with the patience of someone who is actually interested in the answer rather than just filling the space before the next thing. "You're not scared here." It wasn't quite a question. "How was the first night?" Caleb said. "Not anymore." Something moved in Bishop's expression then. It was small. The kind of shift that you would miss if you weren't paying attention, and most people wouldn't have been paying attention. A fractional easing around the eyes. The almost imperceptible release of a vigilance that had been quietly maintained for 3 weeks and was now, just as quietly, being stood down. Good, Bishop said. That's how it should be. He held Caleb's gaze for one more moment. Then he turned and walked away, back across the garage, back to whatever he had been doing, and did not look back. Caleb stood where he was for a moment after he left. He understood what had just happened. He understood it precisely, the way he understood most things, not by being told, but by reading what was actually in front of him. That was a man who had been watching him for 3 weeks with the careful skepticism of someone who takes the security of the people around him seriously enough to withhold trust until it has been earned. And that was the same man, just now, telling him, in the only language that came naturally to him, which was the language of direct statement and nothing extra, that the watching was done, that the assessment was complete. That whatever conclusion he had reached, it was not the one that required continued vigilance. That mattered. Not because Caleb needed the approval, or not only because of that, but because Bishop was not a man who said things he didn't mean or moved toward conclusions he hadn't earned through evidence. His acceptance, given as plainly and as quietly as it had just been given, was the kind that came from somewhere real. And Caleb, who had spent years learning to distinguish between things that were real and things that only performed being real, knew the difference. He put on his jacket and finished closing up the front desk. By the end of that 3rd week, Caleb Reyes had become, without any formal decision, without any announcement, without anyone sitting down and agreeing to it, a part of how the Iron Gate garage worked. Not a guest, not a probationary presence. Something the place had incorporated and was now running on, the way a body incorporates something it needs and builds it into its ordinary functioning without making a fuss about it. But outside those walls, something else had started. A man in a dark blue sedan with out-of-town plates had been seen near the diner on Clement Street, and at the hardware store on Route 9, and at the gas station at the edge of town, where he had spoken to the young man behind the counter for several minutes before driving away. He was asking about someone. A young man, dark-haired, early 20s, recently arrived in Sutter Ridge. The questions were quiet, careful, the kind of questions that are designed not to be remembered. In a town of 8,000 people, quiet questions never stay quiet for long. The information arrived the way most information arrives in a town the size of Sutter Ridge, not through any official channel, not through anything that could be called an investigation, but through the ordinary movement of people who know each other talking to other people who know each other, the way they always have, the way they always will in places where the social fabric is woven tight enough that a thread pulled anywhere is felt everywhere. Grip's wife had heard it from the woman who ran the bakery 2 doors down from the diner on Clement Street, who had heard it from her husband, who had spoken with the man at the hardware store, who had been there when the dark blue sedan had been parked outside, and its driver had come in and asked his careful questions and driven away. By the time it reached Grip, it had passed through 4 people and lost none of its essential shape, because the essential shape of it was simple enough to survive the telling. Someone was asking about the boy. Grip came to find Stone mid-morning. He didn't make a production of it. He simply appeared in the doorway of Stone's office with his arms crossed, and his expression carrying the particular quality that Stone had learned over many years meant the situation outside required his specific attention. Someone's asking around about the kid, Grip said. Dark blue sedan. Out-of-town plates. Been seen at the diner, the hardware store, the gas station on Route 9. Asking about a young man. Dark hair, early 20s, recently arrived. Stone set down what he was holding. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone caught off guard, but the quiet of someone running something through their head that they need to finish running before they open their mouth. Where's Caleb? Front office. Leave him there. Grip nodded once and left. Stone sat for a moment longer. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. The man on the other end was named Gerald Oates. He was not affiliated with the Iron Gate chapter in any formal sense, had never been and would never be, and that was precisely the nature of his usefulness. Gerald existed in the space between things, between the official and the unofficial, between what was known and what could be known with the right questions asked in the right places. Stone had been calling him for 20 years, since an incident involving a county official that Gerald had helped resolve quietly and completely, and without anyone ending up somewhere they didn't want to be. Gerald was discreet in the way that very few people are genuinely discreet, which is to say that his discretion was not a policy but a character trait, as natural to him as breathing. "I need a quiet read on someone," Stone said. "Name Caleb Reyes, 20 years old. He came into Sutter Ridge recently, on his own, and someone with resources is looking for him. I want to know who before they decide to look any harder." Gerald asked 2 questions. Stone answered them. "Give me 24 hours, Gerald said. Stone put the phone down and went back to work. Because the work was still there and it still needed doing, and because Stone had learned long ago that the time between asking a question and receiving its answer is not improved by spending it in anticipation. You work. You wait. The answer arrives when it arrives. It arrived in 16 hours. Gerald called before dawn. Stone was already in his office. He had been there since 4:30, which was not unusual for him, though this particular morning the earliness had less to do with habit and more to do with the fact that sleep had not come easily, and he had stopped trying for it somewhere around 4, and simply gotten up and come to the one place where being awake at that hour made sense. He took the call. He listened. He asked one question. He listened to the answer. Then he sat in his office in the dark for a while before the day began. Caleb arrived at 5:40, which was earlier than usual, which told Stone something in itself. The boy's internal clock had the precision of someone who has spent years in environments where arriving late carried consequences. He came through the side door and crossed the garage floor and saw the light on in Stone's office and stopped. Stone appeared in the doorway. "Come in," he said. "Sit down." Caleb came in. He sat down in the chair across the desk. The same chair he had sat in that first morning, when Stone had told him he was working here. He looked at Stone with those careful dark eyes and waited, the way he always waited, without fidgeting and without rushing the room toward whatever it was moving toward. Stone looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Your name isn't Reyes." The pause that followed was exactly half a second. No longer. The pause of someone who has been carrying a particular truth for long enough that hearing it said out loud by someone else produces not shock, but a very specific, very quiet kind of recognition. The pause of a held breath, briefly held, then released. "No," Caleb said. "Your name is Caleb Moreno, and your stepfather is Vincent Hargrove." The air in the office changed. It didn't change loudly. There was no sharp intake of breath, no visible collapse, no dramatic shift in the boy's posture. It changed the way air changes in a room when something that has been kept out of it is finally allowed in. A pressure shift, almost. A subtle alteration in the quality of the silence. Vincent Hargrove. If you lived in Marsden County, you knew that name. Everybody did. You knew it from the plaque on the wall of the new library annex, from the photograph in the county commissioner's office, from the civic awards ceremonies and the ribbon cuttings and the charitable foundation that had his name on it and funded half the county's community programs. You knew it because for 15 years Vincent Hargrove had positioned himself with the careful patience of a man who understands that reputation is infrastructure. That if you build it wide enough and deep enough and far enough in advance, it becomes the thing people stand on without thinking about what it's made of. He was on 3 civic boards. He had his photograph taken with every elected official in the county. He had funded the library annex and the community health clinic and the sheriff's department retirement fund. And he was the kind of man whose reputation was so carefully constructed, so thoroughly maintained, that questioning it felt almost rude. Almost. The question Stone needed answered now. The question that Caleb Reyes, or Caleb Moreno, had been carrying alone for 5 years without anyone to carry it with him, was what that reputation was actually built on. And whether it could survive what was already sitting in a filing cabinet 30 feet away. Stone leaned forward slightly in his chair and folded his hands on the desk and looked at Caleb with an expression that was not soft, exactly, but that was something more considered than hardness. Something that communicated, without any ambiguity, that what was about to happen in this room was not an interrogation and not a transaction and not anything that required the boy across from him to be afraid. "I need to understand what's happening before it arrives at my door," he said. "Not to hurt you. The opposite." Caleb looked at the desk for a moment. Then he looked at Stone. And what came next, what he said in that small office in the early morning with the day not yet fully light outside the window and the garage quiet around them, was something he had not said out loud to another living person. Not once. Not in the 5 years inside that house, where saying it was unthinkable. Not in the 2 months on the road. where there was no one to say it to, and survival required forward motion rather than looking back. He had carried it the way you carry something that has no container, pressed against the inside of your ribs, present in every room you entered, shaping every decision you made without ever being named. He named it now. His mother's name was Elena. Elena Moreno before she married, Elena Hargrove after, though she had never fully become the second name in the way that some people grow into a married name and some people simply wear it. She had married Vincent Hargrove when Caleb was 12 years old. Caleb remembered the wedding the way you remember things from that age, in images rather than sequence, in the feeling of a room rather than its details. What he remembered most was the way people looked at Vincent Hargrove, with a particular deference that had seemed, at 12, like simply the way adults behaved around important men. It would take him several more years to understand the difference between respect that is given freely and respect that is maintained, because the alternative is costly. Vincent Hargrove presented well. That was the word for it, presented. He was successful and articulate and known in the county for his charitable work, for the foundation that bore his name and funded civic projects and received grateful letters from organizations that depended on it. He was the kind of man who made people feel, in his presence, that they were in the company of someone significant. That quality, the ability to make other people feel elevated simply by being near him, is extraordinarily useful if you are also the kind of man who needs those people not to look too hard at what is underneath the presentation. The first year had been difficult, but manageable. That was how Caleb said it. Difficult, but manageable, with the precision of someone choosing words that are accurate rather than dramatic. Then it wasn't. What Hargrove needed, above everything else, was control, not the ordinary preference for order that most people have to some degree. Something more total than that. Control over his household and everyone in it. Control over the image he projected to the world outside it and the narrative that image was built on. Control, specifically, over Elena, who was warm and perceptive and had a quality of genuine independence that had probably attracted him to her initially, and that he had spent the years of their marriage methodically working to dismantle. She had tried to leave twice before Caleb was 16. Both times she had come back. Caleb said this quietly and without editorializing, and Stone listened without interrupting, and the space between what was said and what it meant sat in the room between them like something with weight. The mechanics of why a person goes back to a situation they have tried to leave are not simple, and they are not the result of weakness, and they are not fully comprehensible to anyone who has not been inside the specific trap that gets built over years. Financially, socially, legally, by someone who understood from the beginning that the goal was not to hold a person by force, but to gradually and systematically remove every alternative until the trap sustains itself. Elena had been in that trap. She died when Caleb was 15. He said it plainly. The words were flat in the specific way that words go flat when they have been lived with so long that the emotion has been separated from them, not because it isn't there, but because it has been compressed somewhere below the level of speech. She was found at the bottom of the stairs. It was ruled accidental. There had been a brief inquiry. A neighbor had reported a disturbance at the house that night, but the inquiry had been closed before it produced anything that mattered. He had people, Caleb said, in a lot of places. Stone's jaw was tight. He said nothing. What followed Elena's death was 5 years that Caleb described with the same careful economy he brought to everything, not minimizing, but not elaborating beyond what was accurate. Hargrove had kept him in the house, not as a son. That word, that relationship, had never been real, and both of them had always known it. As something else. As something that knew things and therefore needed to be kept where it could be monitored and managed and prevented from becoming a problem. Because Caleb had been home the night Elena died. He had been 15 years old, and he had been at the top of the landing. I heard everything, he said. The office was completely still. Those 3 words landed in the room and stayed there. Stone didn't move, didn't look away. He held Caleb's gaze and let the words be what they were without rushing past them or softening them or filling the silence that followed them with anything. Because some silences are not gaps to be filled, but wait to be acknowledged. The 5 years that followed that night had been governed by a single dynamic that Hargrove had never needed to make explicit because he had never needed to make it explicit. They both understood it. Caleb knew what he had heard. Hargrove knew that Caleb knew. And that mutual, unspoken understanding was the instrument of control, more effective than any threat, because a threat can be reported and a threat can be escaped. But a shared secret that implicates you in its keeping by virtue of your silence is something you carry with you wherever you go. The control was not exercised through violence. Not directly. It was exercised through the quiet elimination of alternatives. A school transfer that moved him somewhere far enough that building friendships became difficult. An email account that was monitored. An opportunity that materialized and then evaporated before it could be acted on. The slow, patient removal of every door until the only thing remaining was the arrangement itself, self-sustaining, total. At 20, Caleb had done the arithmetic. The risk of leaving. Of having nothing, knowing no one, starting from zero in a world he had been systematically isolated from, was finite. Unknown, but finite. The certainty of staying was not. He had run smart. Cash only. Nothing that could be tracked or traced. Different towns, never long enough to become findable. He had ended up in Sutter Ridge because the money ran out and the rain started and the light was on at the Iron Gate garage on Millbrook Road, and it was the last door he had the energy to try. Stone was quiet for a long moment when Caleb finished. Then, he's looking for you because he's worried about what you know. Yes. Another silence. Shorter this time. Caleb. Stone's voice was level. But there was something underneath the levelness that had not been there before, something that had been building throughout the telling, and that he was keeping contained with the particular discipline of a man who has learned that the moment you let your anger speak for you is the moment you lose the room. You're not handling this alone anymore. Caleb looked at him. That expression crossed his face again. The one that lived in the narrow space between old suspicion and something more fragile and more recent. The expression of someone who has been told, by people who meant it at the time, that things would be handled, and who has learned through the specific education of experience that this usually meant one problem was traded for another. He had not yet fully learned to trust the version of that offer that was real. But he was looking at Stone, and Stone was looking back at him. And here is what you need to remember, if you have been following this story from the beginning. Do you remember that first night? Grip at the door, the rain, the 8 men who stopped what they were doing one by one. Do you remember Grip asking the boy if he was in trouble with somebody? And do you remember what Caleb said? Not anymore. And the half-second pause before it. Now you know what that pause meant. Now you know what he was measuring in that half-second. The distance between where he had been and where he was standing, and whether it was far enough. Whether he had finally gotten far enough away. He had thought so. As it turned out, the answer was more complicated than distance. 3 days after the conversation in Stone's office, the garage returned to its ordinary rhythm. Because that was what the garage did. It returned to its rhythm, the way a river returns to its course after something has disturbed its surface. The work was still there. The phone still rang. The bike still came in and needed attending to. And Caleb, who had learned long before he arrived in Sutter Ridge that the most reliable thing you can do when the ground beneath you is uncertain is to keep your hands occupied with something real, went back to work. He had been making his way through the back filing cabinet for 2 weeks. A project he worked on in the slow hours, the gaps between tasks, the end of the day when the phones had stopped and the front desk was settled. It was the last organizational task remaining from his first weeks at the garage, and he had been working through it drawer by drawer with the same methodical patience he brought to everything. Most of what he found was exactly what you would expect to find in the filing cabinet of a working garage that had been accumulating paperwork for 23 years. Old invoices, expired insurance documents, parts warranties for bikes that had long since been repaired and returned to their owners, correspondence that had been relevant once and filed and forgotten. He was on the bottom drawer when he found it. It was at the very back, behind a hanging folder that had collapsed sideways at some point and never been straightened, and behind that, 4 years of oil change receipts bundled together with a rubber band that had dried and cracked and was barely holding. He almost missed it. His hand was moving past it toward the receipts when his fingers registered the folders separately. Thicker than the receipts, stiffer, deliberately placed rather than simply accumulated. He pulled it out. A standard manila folder. No label. No identifying marks on the outside of any kind. He opened it. The first document was a copy of an incident report from the Sutter Ridge County Sheriff's Department. The date on it was 7 years ago. He read the heading once. Then he read it again, because the first reading had produced a response in his body that made him want to confirm that his eyes had reported correctly. The subject of the report was the disappearance of a woman named Elena Reyes. His mother's maiden name. His real name. His hands went completely still. Not the trained stillness he had arrived with. Not the learned stillness of a person making themselves small. This was different. This was the stillness of a system that has just received information it does not yet know how to process, going quiet while it tries. He read every word of the report. Slowly. Completely. It had been filed by a deputy named T. Rollins. It described the discovery that Elena Reyes had been reported missing by a neighbor. The neighbor's name was not given in this copy, redacted in the margin with a single clean line. An initial inquiry had been made. The case had subsequently been reassigned. And then it had been closed, when information came forward indicating that Elena Reyes had left her residence voluntarily for personal reasons and that no further investigation was warranted. That last line. The closing of the case, the determination that nothing further was required, was signed by the county sheriff, a man named Paul Greer. Paul Greer had retired 4 years ago. His retirement had been marked by a celebration at the Sutter Ridge County Civic Center, where 3 plaques bearing his name had been unveiled on the wall of the main hall, each one donated by the Hargrove Family Foundation. Caleb set the incident report down on the floor beside him and looked at the second document. It was a letter, handwritten, personal stationery, cream-colored, plain, the kind of stationery a person buys without a particular occasion in mind, just to have. He recognized the handwriting before he read a single word of it. That is not a figure of speech. He recognized it in the way you recognize a voice you have not heard in years. Not through conscious analysis, not through the methodical comparison of remembered characteristics, but instantly and entirely, in your body, before your brain has caught up with what your eyes have reported. The specific slant of the letters, the way certain characters connected and others didn't, the pressure of the pen, visible even in a copy, heavier on the downstrokes. His mother had written this letter. It was dated 8 years ago. She would have been 34. Caleb would have been 12. The year of the wedding, the year everything began its slow change into something else. The letter was addressed to no one. It began without salutation, without preamble, in the same careful and precise language that Elena Moreno had brought to everything she did. The language of a woman who thought before she wrote, and wrote only what she meant. In it she described, over several pages, a series of incidents she had witnessed, decisions she had seen made, names she had heard spoken in conversations she was not supposed to hear, transactions she had observed that did not align with the public accounting of them. She described the architecture of what Vincent Hargrove was, not as accusation, not in the register of someone venting fear or anger, but in the register of someone creating a record. Someone who understood, with a clarity that must have cost her something to maintain, that what she was writing might need to exist without her there to explain it, that it might need to stand on its own someday, in a context she couldn't predict, read by someone she couldn't prepare. She had written it to survive past her own silence. At the bottom of the last page, below her signature, she had written 2 more sentences in slightly different ink. Added later, he thought, at a different moment, with a different pen. I am leaving this somewhere I believe will be kept safe. I don't know what else to do with it right now. If you're reading this, and I'm not here, please understand that I tried to do the right thing. Caleb read those 3 sentences. Then he read them again. Then he read them a 3rd time. And he sat on the floor of the back room of the Iron Gate garage with his mother's handwriting in his hands, and he understood several things simultaneously, that she had known, or feared, or at some level accepted the possibility of what was coming. That she had done something with that knowledge rather than simply carrying it. That she had chosen this place, this specific building, these specific men, as the place where the truth would be safest. That she had trusted it to hold what she could no longer hold herself. And that it had, for 7 years, without anyone knowing, it had. Then he did something he had not done since he was 15 years old, standing at the top of a landing in a house that was no longer safe. Understanding something that no 15-year-old should have to understand. He cried. Not quietly. Not in the controlled, careful way he did most things. The way that kept him contained and functional and invisible. The real kind. The kind that comes up from somewhere below the level of decision. That does not ask permission and does not wait for an appropriate moment and does not care about the sounds it makes. The kind that has been stored for years in a place too compressed and too necessary to be accessed until this exact moment, when the thing that had been stored there had somewhere finally, irrevocably to go. For minutes, perhaps a little more. Then it stopped, the way that kind always stops. Not because it's finished, exactly, but because the body reaches the limit of what it can sustain at that pitch and returns, gradually, to something closer to its ordinary register. He sat with it for a moment after. Then he dried his face with the sleeve of his jacket. Then he stood up. He picked up the folder. He held it against his chest for a moment. The way you hold something that is both precious and almost too heavy to carry, because it is both of those things at once. Then he opened the door and stepped out into the garage. Wrench was the first person he saw. He looked at Wrench and he said, in a voice that was completely level in the way that voices go level on the other side of something enormous, "Get Stone." Wrench looked at his face. Just for a moment. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't ask if Caleb was all right. He simply put down the wrench in his hand, set it down carefully, deliberately, on the workbench beside him, and walked toward Stone's office without a word. If Vincent Hargrove represents everything you believe is wrong with how power protects itself, men who hurt the people who trusted them, and then spend years and resources and influence making absolutely certain that nobody finds out, then take a moment right now and comment below, Elena deserved better. If you have ever known someone who was silenced by someone more powerful. If you have ever watched the truth get buried by someone with enough money and enough connections to dig the hole and fill it in and put a plaque on top of it, this story is for them. This moment is for them. And if you want to see more stories like this one, stories where the truth finds a way through, where the right door opens at the right moment, where the people nobody expected turn out to be exactly who was needed, subscribe to this channel. Because cowards won't, but you will. Stone was there in 30 seconds. He came through the door and closed it behind him and looked at Caleb, at the folder held against his chest, at the face of the boy holding it, at everything that face was carrying in that moment. And he didn't ask if he was all right, because the answer to that question was complex enough that asking it would have been a way of avoiding the thing that actually needed to happen. He held out his hand. Caleb gave him the folder. Then he stood with his arms crossed and his back straight and watched Stone read. He watched Stone's face move through the first document and into the second, watched the quality of his stillness change as understanding accumulated. Not dramatically, not with any outward display, but in the way a man's stillness changes when what he is reading is landing somewhere personal. The controlled anger was visible only if you knew how to look for it. It was running very hot underneath a surface that Stone kept deliberately, effortfully level. He read to the end of the letter. Then he read the last 3 sentences again. He set the folder down on the desk with the particular care you give something that has weight beyond its physical dimensions. And he was quiet for a moment before he spoke. "Where did you find this?" "Back of the filing cabinet," Caleb said. "Bottom drawer." "Who put it there?" "I don't know. But my mother wrote that letter 8 years ago, which means someone kept it safe. Someone here." Stone looked at the folder. Then he looked at Caleb. He set both hands flat on the desk. "I met your mother once," he said. The room went completely still. Caleb didn't move, didn't speak. He waited with the absolute attention of someone receiving information they have needed for a very long time and are not going to interrupt. 7 years ago, Stone said. She came to this garage. She asked me whether she could trust someone at the county level, someone in law enforcement, to do the right thing if she brought them something serious. He stopped. His jaw was set in the way it had been set through the telling of Caleb's story that morning. The particular tightness of a man keeping something contained that would prefer not to be contained. I told her it depended on the information and the person. She didn't tell me anything specific. She seemed frightened. A pause. I should have pushed harder. Caleb looked at him steadily. She left and didn't come back. No, Stone said. She didn't. The weight of 7 years settled between them in that small office. Not as accusation. Caleb offered none, and Stone would not have deflected it if he had, but as something shared. The recognition of what had been lost and what, despite everything, had managed to survive. What she had put in motion in the time she had, with the resources available to her, trusting a place she had no guarantee would hold what she left in it. It had held. This changes things, Caleb said. Yes, Stone said. It does. Elena Reyes hadn't simply left a letter in a filing cabinet. She had made a choice, a specific, deliberate, considered choice about where the truth would be safest and who could be trusted to keep it long enough for it to matter. She had chosen this building. These men. The Iron Gate Hells Angels garage on Millbrook Road in Sutter Ridge, which the town had spent 23 years misunderstanding. She had been right. The truth had survived. Her son had found it. And now, for the first time in 7 years, it was finally going to matter. Stone made the first call within the hour. Carol Deakins was a paralegal at a civil rights firm in the city, and she was the kind of person whose value lies not in volume, but in precision. She said less than most people and meant more by it. And in the 2 prior occasions Stone had needed someone he could trust with something that required both legal knowledge and complete discretion, she had been exactly what the situation required. He told her what they had: the letter, the incident report, the sheriff's signature on the closing line, the foundation grant connecting that signature to Vincent Hargrove's money. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "Get me everything." That sheriff's signature on a foundation grant, Stone, that's not nothing. He told her it was coming. He ended the call and immediately made the second one, to Gerald Oates, and said 3 words: "Find T. Rollins." Then he sat with the phone in his hand for several minutes before he made the third call, because the third call was to the man whose name was on the incident report. The deputy who had filed it 7 years ago, and whose name had sat at the bottom of that first page in the folder that had been waiting in the filing cabinet for exactly as long. Stone did not know yet what he was going to find at the end of that call. He knew only that it needed to be made, and that whatever was on the other end of it would either open the next door or close it. He dialed. T. Rollins answered on the second ring. He sounded older than Stone had expected. Not elderly, but carrying the particular tiredness of a man who has been holding something heavy for a long time and has stopped expecting to be able to put it down. Stone began to explain why he was calling. He had not finished the second sentence when Rollins said, "I was wondering how long before someone found that file." Stone went completely still. "You put it there," he said. "Yes," Rollins said. "I put it there." What Rollins told him over the next 30 minutes was this. 7 years ago, Elena Reyes had come to his home, not to the department, to his home, on a Tuesday evening in October, because she had understood by that point that the department and the home were not the same thing, and that what she needed could only be found in one of them. She had been afraid. She had documentation. The letter and other materials she had assembled over the preceding months with the careful patience of a woman who understood she was building something that might need to outlast her. She had chosen Rollins specifically because he had responded to an earlier call at the Hargrove property, a call that had been classified afterward as a domestic disturbance with no further action required. And she had seen something in him when he left that evening. A discomfort. A man who was unhappy with the classification he had been required to apply. She was right. He had been deeply unhappy with it. He took the documents she brought. He hid the originals and made copies, and he began to build toward doing something with them. And then Elena died 2 months later, and the inquiry that followed was shut down before he could get any footing beneath him. The pressure that came from above was not loud. It never is when it comes from people who are practiced at applying it. It left no fingerprints. It simply made very clear, in the professional language of consequence and implication, that pursuing this would end his career and possibly more than his career. He had a daughter in school, a wife with a health condition. He was 54 years old with nowhere else to go. He retired early. And he put the folder in the one place he could think of in Sutter Ridge that he trusted to be beyond the reach of the people he was afraid of. "Why didn't you say anything?" Stone said. "In 7 years. Because I was scared," Rollins said. The plainness of it was its own kind of statement. No softening, no qualification, no construction of a more defensible version of the truth. "I had a daughter in school, and Vincent Hargrove had just gotten the county sheriff elected." A pause that had years in it. "I'm not proud of it." Stone was quiet for a moment. "Are you still scared?" A long silence. Long enough that the question seemed to settle into something before the answer came back out of it. "I'm 61 years old," Rollins said finally. "And Elena Reyes' son is apparently alive, and he found the documents, and you're calling me. Which means the thing I've been waiting 7 years for is maybe finally happening." Another pause, shorter. "No. I'm not scared anymore. I'm tired of being scared. Will you make a formal statement?" "Yes," Rollins said. "Whatever you need. Here is what matters about what T. Rollins did 7 years ago, and it is worth saying clearly. He hadn't buried the truth. He had hidden it. And those are not the same thing. Burying is permanent. Burying is the intention that something should not be found. What Rollins had done was place the truth somewhere he believed would hold it. Somewhere beyond the jurisdiction of the people who wanted it gone. and wait, with the guilty patience of a man who knows he should have done more and cannot find the courage to do it alone, for someone else to arrive who could. He had chosen a Hells Angels garage over his own department. And for 7 years, without a single person inside those walls knowing it, the Iron Gate chapter had been keeping Elena Reyes' secret safe. They just hadn't known it yet. 2 days after Stone's call with Rollins, at 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning, a black SUV pulled up to the front of the Iron Gate garage on Millbrook Road and parked along the curb with the particular deliberateness of a vehicle whose occupants have decided in advance exactly where they intend to be and intend to be noticed being there. 2 men got out. Suits. Both of them. The kind of suits that communicate, before their wearers have said a single word, that the people inside them are accustomed to being in rooms where their presence carries weight. Not police, attorneys, and not junior ones. The senior partner introduced himself by name, a name that Stone recognized as belonging to a firm with offices in 3 cities that had represented Vincent Hargrove's various interests for the better part of 15 years. Grip had come to find Stone the moment the SUV pulled up, with the look on his face that meant the situation outside required Stone's specific presence. Stone had come out through the garage door and onto the sidewalk and stood in front of the 2 men with his arms at his sides and waited for them to begin. The senior partner began. "Mr. Callahan, my client has become aware that you may be in possession of certain private documents. He's asked us to open a conversation about their voluntary return." Stone looked at him. "What documents?" "Personal correspondence and certain related materials that my client believes were removed from his property without authorization." A pause, precise and practiced. "By Caleb Hargrove." "Caleb Reyes," Stone said. His voice was the same as it always was. Level. Unhurried. Carrying no more weight than the words themselves required, and no less. "His name is Caleb Reyes." The attorney absorbed this without visible reaction. "Mr. Callahan, my client is simply concerned about the boy's welfare. He would very much like to." "Your client," Stone said, "sent a private investigator to this town for 6 weeks. He said it the way he said everything, conversationally, without heat, without the kind of raised volume that people use when they want to signal that they mean what they're saying and aren't sure the other person believes it. Stone never had that problem. That's not how you look for someone you're worried about. That's how you look for someone you need to reach before they do something you're worried about." The attorney said nothing. "Call your client," Stone said. "Tell him that whatever he believes is in those documents. The contents are currently in the hands of an attorney who is preparing a formal review request to the state attorney's office. Tell him that a former county deputy is prepared to give a signed statement. Tell him that the review request is being filed whether or not any documents are returned, because the documents are not the only evidence." He took 1 step back, not retreat, punctuation, and tell him that the next time he wants to have a conversation, he uses the appropriate channels, because that is the only channel that is open to him now. The 2 attorneys looked at each other. It was a brief look, a fraction of a second. But it was there, and it contained within it the specific quality of a recalculation being made. Then the senior partner said that he would relay Stone's position, and both men got back into the black SUV, and the SUV pulled away from the curb and drove down Millbrook Road and did not come back. Stone stood on the sidewalk for a moment and watched it go. Then he turned around and walked back into the garage. Every man in the building was watching him. Grip from near the entrance, Wrench from the shop floor, Bishop from the back, arms crossed, still as always, but with something in his expression that was different from his ordinary stillness, something that had the quality of a judgment made and confirmed. Stone looked at all of them. "Back to work," he said. They went back to work. "Do you remember what Caleb said on that first night, standing in the rain in the entrance of this garage, when Stone asked how he'd ended up at their door? 6 places, he'd said. Most of them closed before he finished asking. He had spent the better part of his life being turned away by people with power, turned away or managed or contained or simply ignored, the way people with power ignore the ones they believe have none. Now he was watching a man with no institutional authority, no civic plaques, no foundation bearing his name, no 15-year relationship with the county's elected officials. Watching that man send 2 attorneys from one of the most connected legal firms in the region back to one of the most powerful men in Marsden County. Empty-handed. Vincent Hargrove spent 15 years making sure his name was attached to the right buildings and the right causes and the right people. Men like that count on one thing above everything else. They count on people staying quiet. They build their entire architecture of protection on the assumption that silence is the default. That the cost of speaking will always feel higher than the cost of staying silent, and that most people, when it comes to it, will choose the lower cost. If you believe the quiet ones deserve to be heard, if you believe that a mother's letter, written in fear and hidden in faith, deserves to outlast the man who spent years trying to make sure it never surfaced, then comment below right now. The truth doesn't have an expiration date. And if you're not already subscribed to this channel, now is the time. Because people who stay silent let men like Hargrove win. You don't have to. 5 weeks passed. The garage ran. The phones rang. Bikes came in and went out. Caleb answered the intake calls and managed the scheduling and cross-referenced the supply invoices and continued, in the slow hours, learning the mechanical work from wrench with the same focused retention he brought to everything. The investigation moved at the pace investigations move. Institutional, procedural, outside the control of anyone in the Irongate garage. And Stone had learned long ago that the only sane response to waiting for something you cannot accelerate is to keep your hands occupied with the work that is actually in front of you. So they worked, and they waited. The call came on a Tuesday morning. Stone was in his office when Carol Deacon's name appeared on his phone. He answered on the first ring. He listened for 90 seconds without speaking. He asked one question. He listened to the answer. Then he put the phone down and stood up and walked out of his office and across the garage floor to the front office, where Caleb was already at his desk, had been there since before 6, as he almost always was now, the intake board in front of him, the phone log open, the morning already organized and running. Stone came through the door, and Caleb looked up. He read Stone's face the way he read everything, completely, immediately, taking in every piece of available information before processing any of it. Stone said, "They filed." Caleb did not move. For a moment, he simply sat exactly as he had been sitting, hands flat on the surface of the desk, the intake board in front of him, the pen he had been holding set down at some point without his having noticed doing it. His face was controlled in the way his face was always controlled. But beneath the control, something was moving. Something large and long compressed was moving, and he was holding himself very still around it. "What are the charges?" Stone told him. "Involuntary manslaughter, obstruction of justice, corruption of public process." The county sheriff's documented involvement with the Hargrove Family Foundation grants woven into the obstruction record. The financial relationships, the closed inquiry, the sign line at the bottom of a report that should never have been closed. All of it in the formal record now. All of it part of a proceeding that could not be quietly reassigned or shut down before it produced anything that mattered. Caleb listened to all of it. Hands flat, face controlled, not moving. When Stone finished, the office was quiet for a moment. Then Caleb said, "Her name is in the charges." It was not quite a question. It had the quality of a thing being confirmed rather than asked. The way you say something out loud that you need to hear in the air outside your own head before you can fully receive it is true. "Yes," Stone said. "Elena Reyes. Her name is in the charges." Caleb closed his eyes. Not for long. Not dramatically, just long enough to hold something that needed holding. To be, for the space of a few quiet seconds, alone with what it meant. That her name was in the record now. That it was documented and formal and permanent in a way that nothing and nobody could quietly reassign or close or sign off on with a pen connected to a foundation grant. That she had been seen, finally, after 7 years of being officially invisible, by something with the weight of the law behind it. When he opened his eyes, his expression was something that had no single clean name. It was grief, because the grief had never gone anywhere and never would. It was relief, because the thing that had been pressing against the inside of his chest for 5 years and longer had finally found somewhere to go. And it was something else underneath both of those, something older and quieter and more settled than either. The expression of a thing that has been trying to become real for 7 years and has finally, irrevocably, become real. "She put it somewhere safe," he said quietly. "She trusted this place to hold it long enough." "Yes," Stone said. Caleb looked at him. She was right. Then Caleb straightened in his chair. He picked up his pen. He pulled the intake board toward him. He looked at the morning's first entry, and he began his day. The same way he had begun every day in this garage, with his hands on the work that was in front of him and his attention on the thing that actually needed doing. Because the work was still there, and it was his. There is one more thing to tell you. In the first weeks after Caleb joined the Iron Gate garage, Reyes had pointed him toward a project that had been sitting in the corner of the main bay for longer than anyone could precisely remember. A 1971 Harley-Davidson FX Superglide that belonged to a retired foreman named Deke Whitfield. Deke had inherited it from his older brother, who had loved it the way certain men love certain machines. Not as a possession, but as a companion, something that had carried him through a particular stretch of his life and meant something specific because of it. The brother had been gone for 3 years. The bike had not run since before he died. Deke wanted it running again. Caleb had spent 3 months on it. Not continuously, in the hours between other work, in the slow afternoons, in the early mornings before the phone started. He had approached it the way he approached everything, which was to understand it completely before he touched it, and then to work through it methodically and without shortcuts, because shortcuts are how you fix the surface of something without fixing what's underneath. He finished it on a Saturday morning. He primed it. He sat on the stool beside it for a moment. Then he turned it over. The engine caught on the second try. It settled into a rhythm that was low and even and steady. The sound of something that has been broken for a long time and has been brought, with patience and care and the willingness to do the work correctly, all the way back. The sound filled the garage and went out through the open roll-up door and into the morning air on Millbrook Road and just kept going. Deke Whitfield stood beside it with his arms crossed and his head down and his eyes on the engine. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He just listened. Then he said, "My brother would have wept." Caleb smiled. Not a performance of one. Not the careful, managed expression of someone who has learned to produce the appropriate response for the appropriate moment. Just the face a person makes. Unguarded, unplanned, completely real. When something has gone exactly the way it was supposed to go. When the work has been worth the doing, and the doing has been worth the time, and everything has landed where it was always meant to land. Reyes was standing behind him. He said nothing. He reached forward and clapped Caleb once on the shoulder. Brief, firm, the contact of a man who communicates what matters through action rather than words, and always has. And then he turned and walked back across the garage to whatever he had been doing before. And that was enough. It was, in every sense that mattered, exactly enough. The story of the Iron Gate Hell's Angels garage and the 20-year-old boy who walked in out of the rain became the kind of story that gets told differently depending on who's telling it. But the essential truth of it, the thing that stayed the same in every version, was this. A young man with nothing except his mother's handwriting and 7 years of things he'd never been able to say walked through the most unlikely door in Sutter Ridge and asked for a chance. And the men inside gave it to him. Not because they were supposed to, because they chose to. Elena Reyes had put something in that building because she believed it would be kept safe long enough to matter. She was right. Her son made sure of it. If this story moved you, if you believe that the truth is worth protecting even when the people protecting it are the last ones the world expected, subscribe to this channel. Hit the like button if Elena Reyes deserved better. And comment below with the one word that describes what Stone and his crew did for that boy. I'll be reading every single one. See you in the next story.